Thanks everyone for coming to this IISS discussion meeting, part of our Manama Dialogue series of programs before the Manama Dialogue, which starts this weekend in Manama, Bahrain. We're going to talk today about the future of U.S. policy in the Middle East. This is a very broad subject. We've only got 1 hour to do it, so we're going to do the best we can. I want to focus on the development of U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East under the Trump administration and maybe beyond if we can. In particular, what are the goals of U.S. Middle East policy under the current administration, how these may differ from administrations of the past, and how might they evolve over time. Joining me are two experts on the region who bring different perspectives, but we just had a nice chat and I think we're going to be compatible. On my right is Dr. Mara Karlin, the acting director of the Strategic Studies program at Johns Hopkins SAIS. She joined there as an associate professor of the practice of strategic studies in June 2017. Mara also serves as executive director of the Merrill Center for Strategic Studies and as a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. In a previous life, she was a U.S. Civil servant. She served under 5 U.S. Secretaries of Defense, most recently as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. On my left, Michael Singh is Senior Fellow and Managing Director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also is a former government employee. He was Senior Director for Middle East Affairs for the National Security Council 2005 to 2008. He had also served as a special assistant to Secretaries of State Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. Michael is a friend of IISS. He's joined several of our workshops on the Middle East, which is why I asked you to come and do this one again, because I know you're good. So we're going to start off with just kind of some short introductory kind of remarks from the two panelists. I'll pose some additional questions to them each, and then we'll go to you all for further questions, and we'll finish up within an hour. I want to start, Mara, by asking your thoughts on U.S. interests in the Middle East region, how they're shifting, and how to rethink the U.S. approach.
Great, thank you.
And here, use this, and...
Thank you. It's a real treat to be here with my former colleague, Mike, and to see such a terrific audience. I think we're already nervous about the great questions we're going to get asked shortly. I thought I would spend my 2 or 3 minutes throwing out a bunch of highly provocative statements on the region, and then we might perhaps discuss them a bit more in Q&A. So the biggest one is that the Middle East matters less to the United States. And that is for a whole bunch of reasons. In particular, it is due to the shifting global power balance with China and with Russia. Effectively, while the Middle East is still relevant, the challenge posed by China in Asia, by Russia in Europe, is of more importance to the United States. And I think you've seen this reflected in the Trump administration's strategy, at least as written on paper, in the National Security Strategy, and in Secretary Mattis's National Defense Strategy. So at one level, the Middle East matters less because other things matter a lot more. On another level, when we look at the conflicts in the region, they are increasingly sub-state rather than between and among states, particularly the potential for future conflicts. And those are less significant for the United States, especially when we look at U.S. involvement in the region throughout history. If you look at the 80s, the 70s, 60s, you name it. And then the third big reason, of course, is that we see a diversification in the energy markets. Now, those shifts are complicated, no doubt, but nevertheless, it means that the U.S. anchoring to the region is less of an issue than we saw, say, 10, 15 years or so ago. So what does this mean for U.S. strategy? When we look at the last 2 decades or so, we see 2 extreme attempts at dealing with the Middle East. We see what you could think of as a real maximalist approach to the Middle East. This would be epitomized, say, by the Iraq War, for example. This is a more interventionist approach. And we see, of course, some good comes out of that and a whole lot of not good comes out of that. The other approach we've seen is a more minimal one. This is, of course, epitomized by President Obama's response or lack thereof to the chaos in Syria. That also has had profound costs, as all of us know, particularly destabilizing not just the region, but also European unity. So a couple things to recognize. The desires that the U.S. has and those of its partners are different. We see a number of examples where our partners have tried to pull us in, and we have faced particularly the moral hazard or other costs of only doing so halfway. Yemen is a perfect example here. The U.S. has supplied the Saudis and the Emiratis with all sorts of precision-guided munitions that appear not to have been used in terribly precise ways, and thus has taken blame for what has happened. Ideally, going forward, you would want to see the U.S. be much more clear about what it is willing to do, what it is not willing to do. What risks will it take for the region, and to articulate to its partners, to its adversaries, to its frenemies, what risks it will not do so. This does, of course, require acknowledging that our partners in the region are profoundly flawed in all sorts of ways. You have some that are operationally effective and strategically misaligned, the example here, of course, being the Syrian opposition. You have others that have different interests than the United States. So to wrap up, there's this wonderful quote that Ralph Waldo Emerson would ask friends when he would see them after a long time, and he would say, "So what has become clear to you since we last met?" And I would wrap up by saying what has become clear is that the Middle East mattering less to the United States may be okay for the United States, probably much less so for the Middle East. Thanks.
Okay, that's very good, Mara. Concise, powerful, punchy, just what I asked you to do. Michael, you can play off of what Mara had to say, but in terms of interest, but I'd like to also hear you a little bit more on U.S. policy and maybe how policy in the Middle East fits into broader Trump administration policy on great power diplomacy.
Sure. Well, thanks, Mark. And it's a pleasure to be with Mara. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone in the audience. A distinguished audience. I note I see at least 2 former assistant secretaries in the audience, which means you have great drawing power here, Mark. I'm going to, just to keep this fun, I'm going to disagree with Mara explicitly and say I think the Middle East is going to become more important in the future and not less important, and I'll explain why. In a way, it's a sort of counterintuitive notion because if you heard Wes Mitchell the other day, if you've read the national security strategy of the Trump administration or the national defense strategy, the theme that comes out of all these documents and speeches is that we are moving away from a sort of grand strategy focused on countering terrorism, the global war on terror that was essentially commenced in 2001 following the 9/11 attacks, and to something that looks more like great power competition, a modern version of great power competition, which ironically enough is sort of where George W. Bush was prior to 9/11. So in a way, we're returning to what we had thought would be our grand strategy prior to 9/11. And while I think we all understand why a terrorism-focused grand strategy, or terrorism-focused, maybe grand strategy is the wrong word, sort of global policy, would lead us to focus very much on the Middle East, maybe it's less obvious why a great power competition-focused strategy would. But if you think about the history of the United States, of Great Britain, of Russia, of the world's great powers, and how that intersects with the Middle East has in fact been a theater, an arena for great power competition for centuries. Now, that has been often what has drawn powers into the Middle East, is not a great desire to be there. That's certainly not the case for the United States now, and hasn't been for a while. It's this sense of a need to compete with others who might otherwise dominate the region or who are already active in the region. When the United States became quite active in the Middle East, starting in the 1960s and 70s, you can read, for example, a foreign affairs piece by the recently departed Walter LaCure on this. It was in large part because the Soviets were there, and there was a need that the U.S. perceived to compete with the Soviets. When we established CENTCOM in, I think, the 1980s, it was because, again, of a worry about the Soviet Union invading Iran and seizing the oil fields across southern Iraq and Iran. And so concern about great power competition has, in fact, been the foundation of our presence in the Middle East for a very long time. And I would argue that as we enter this new phase of great power competition, the Middle East is not going to become less relevant, but it'll become more relevant. In fact, we see this playing out now. We can see, I think, quite visibly, Russia becoming, once again, very interested in playing an influential role in this region, not just through Syria, but in other places as well. And we worry in all of our relationships in the region about hedging by these regional powers, or even about Russia displacing the United States somehow. I'd argue those worries maybe are overblown right now, but that's another question. I would argue we should also be looking at China, which more quietly, more subtly, and perhaps in a more sophisticated way, is also playing a greater role across the Middle East, not just economically, which is what most people tend to point to when they look at Chinese foreign policy, but also diplomatically, not with great effect yet, also militarily, establishing, for example, its first naval base in the Horn of Africa and Djibouti right next to our own military facilities. So I would argue that the Middle East is actually going to be quite important in the future. And the Middle East's resources, its maritime passageways, its airspace will also be very important. And this is going to play out very much so in relationships like Turkey, which sits at a crossroads between Asia and Europe. How will this play into policy? I think we'll get into this a bit more in the Q&A, but the Obama administration, and probably even more so the Trump administration, has really wanted to take a bit of an arm's length approach to this region for lots of obvious reasons, which I don't think I need to spell out here. And we have wanted, I think, to shift more of the burden onto our regional allies, who are themselves quite wealthy and in many ways quite capable. And the complaints you would have heard from the Obama administration and early on in the Trump administration were about free riding by our allies, just as we complain about free riding by allies in most regions of the world. Ironically enough, now what you'll hear, especially now, today in light of recent events, is not complaints about free riding, but complaints about our allies being too ambitious and maybe too active in the region. And I think this really demonstrates the conundrum that we face. We don't want to do everything ourselves. We often find ourselves being pulled into the Middle East because there really isn't anyone in the Middle East or outside the Middle East who will take care of those interests for us. We have to do it ourselves. But at the same time, when we step back, oftentimes we face just as many, if not more, problems than when we are deeply involved. And so the question, I think, will be, is there a happy medium there somewhere? I tend to think that there is, because I'm an eternal optimist and I work at a Middle East-focused think tank, and so my profession is at stake here. But it isn't a happy medium that is somehow easy or inexpensive. I think that the type of engagement we're going to need in the Middle East to build up capable allies is an intensive and frankly expensive type of engagement, even if it's not fighting wars, even if it's not Iraq 2003. And I think that's what the future will hold for us in the region.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. Again, punchy, powerful, and concise. I didn't mean to structure this as a debate. Mara, I'm going to go back.
Mara and I can't help it when we encounter each other.
And that's what you're doing in the green room. I tried to stop you. You can respond to that, but I want to extend this a little bit and ask you, you can keep that from, oh, no, she needs it, yeah. Ask you about regional security challenges, how we should think about them, and what's working, what's not working from a U.S. perspective, if you don't mind.
Great. I'll start with a rejoinder, of course, to Mike's really smart points, of which I somewhat disagree. Because here's the thing. There's competition and there's preparing for conflict. Both are relevant. You cannot do them both equally. And I think that's our challenge. You use the Soviet Union and the Cold War as an example, right? So because of competition, the U.S. gets involved in all sorts of problematic things, right? So you see the war in Vietnam that cost 58,000 American lives. That's an effort to compete with communism. Doesn't work. Instead, you could argue it is the U.S. effort to prepare for conflict that then plays the outsized role in the U.S. finally winning the Cold War. So why is that relevant to the Middle East today? It means that at a U.S. global strategic level, the U.S. needs to be prioritizing preparing for conflict and competing with China and Russia in their own regions first. Should they also do so somewhat with extra bandwidth in the Middle East and in Africa? Absolutely. But that has to be what's left over. If that is your primary focus, it will become quite clear to both of those powers that the already diminishing comparative military advantages that the U.S. has had conventionally are only going to get worse. So I think our debate is over opportunity costs and priorities. So what does this mean for regional security, as you're asking? The U.S. over the last 2 decades, of course, has built up a pretty substantial military posture in the Middle East. We see this arrayed across the Gulf and somewhat throughout the Levant as well. And I think we are starting to see some shifts. I think these are smart shifts by the Pentagon in recognizing what are the sorts of wars that the U.S. is probably going to be involved with in the future. At least over the next decade or so, it's probably not going to have a large conflict a la Iraq '03. So its capabilities in the region can somewhat go down. We've seen this in the notion that the U.S. has not had a carrier presence in the Gulf since March, which is pretty significant because for about 2 decades it had a continual carrier presence. That said, in the 80s and 90s, folks would have said that was a pretty silly approach. So you want to think a little bit about the security scenarios going forward. And when I brainstorm those, I'm particularly worried about terrorism, of course. That requires capabilities like special operations forces. It requires intel cooperation with all sorts of partners around the region. So I worry about terrorism writ large. I worry in particular about this issue of Iran. And that's a complicated, multifaceted issue of which Mike can speak about, no doubt, a whole lot smarter than I can. But that said, the sorts of things I would want in the region, because I worry about Iran, would similarly be special operations forces. I would want decent air and maritime capability. I'd want some missile defense capabilities in particular. I would want to try to get regional actors to knit together their capabilities along these lines so as to confront Iran in these multiple approaches. That's probably what I worry about the most when I think about the security environment in the region. That requires ignoring, frankly, a whole lot of hideous security problems that have engulfed the region, right? Recognizing that contributing to them or playing a part in them, Yemen being, of course, a great example, actually doesn't further U.S. national security interest.
Thanks very much, Mara. Mike, in your opening remarks, you talked about the great power competition as the resumed paradigm for U.S. involvement in the region. It's contrary to the way I had been thinking about it, that U.S. involvement in the region, to me, seemed driven for a long time by 2 sets of actors. One, those actors who were U.S. partners, and we were in the Middle East because they wanted us to be, and we needed to defend them. And of course, Israel is the major one there, but Saudi Arabia also in that camp. And the other set of actors are those that are creating trouble, and the United States is in the region to try to quell that trouble or to contain those actors. And of course, Mara just mentioned Iran. So is that prism of looking at the Middle East and U.S. involvement in the Middle East through these 2 prisms of helping Israel/Saudi Arabia and countering Iran not the right way to see what U.S. interests and policy making is all about in the Middle East?
I guess what I would say, Mark, is I think those prisms are compatible. When Mara talked about interests, I think that most of us who have studied the region would really come up with a very similar list of interests. It's things like energy, free flow of commerce, nonproliferation, counterterrorism. There's a fairly standard list, kind of minus 1 or 2 that we could quibble about. But when you get to the level of objectives and strategy, I would argue that what for a long time we saw as most threatening to those interests in the region was some external hegemon like the Soviet Union coming in and excluding the United States from the sea lanes, from relationships with countries like Egypt and Israel and so forth. And so a lot of these relationships, if you're looking at them historically, I think come about as a result of competition largely with the Soviets at that time. And there's lots of interesting stories. For example, the Iranians established diplomatic relations with China before Nixon went to China, before the United States did, in part because the Shah, even though he's reputed as sort of a close ally of the United States, wanted to avoid being captive to a relationship with the United States. There's a long history there that I think often now is forgotten, but will suddenly, I think, become more interesting as we think about great power competition today. I think once the Soviet Union fell, then we thought about the region in a different way. And we thought about the threats to those interests in a different way. We thought about, for example, Iran as being a threat to the interests, those interests arising largely from the confrontations we had with Iran in the late 1980s. We thought about terrorist groups, like Palestinian terrorist groups at first, then Hezbollah, and then Al-Qaeda and so forth, being a major threat to those interests and the security of our allies on which our strategy depended. And so I would say that our conception of what are the right objectives, what is the right strategy, has shifted over time, even as those interests have held relatively constant. And what I would say about sort of the point that Mara made about prioritization is I think it's just never quite been that simple, and I don't think it'll be that simple in the future, in the sense that if you're concerned about, say, competing with China in Asia, which seems to really be the primary focus of American strategy these days. I mean, if you look, for example, the decision to withdraw from the INF, an interesting decision in its own right, I see the primary motivating factor as being China, rather than, say, just punishing Russian violations, which is kind of a bonus reason to do it. But the energy for China, the energy for our allies in Asia comes from the Middle East, comes from Saudi Arabia, comes from Iran, along with a handful of other places. And so suddenly, again, the sort of those maritime choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz, shipping lanes like the Arabian Sea, take on a new dimension of importance if we suddenly find ourselves in some kind of global rivalry. Now, I don't think we're in a global rivalry yet, and I hope that we won't get to that point. But if that's what we're preparing for, then we need to be sure, for example, that we maintain dominance over those choke points. We wouldn't want to see a Chinese fleet patrolling the Strait of Hormuz, however benign they might portray themselves. We would want to see the Fifth Fleet, I think, maintaining control of that. Whether that's control by having carriers inside the Gulf or control from further away is a strategic question to be answered. But I think that the Middle East is part of a competition in all these other places. I think that's how it's been throughout history, and I don't see that changing in a significant way. So I would say that the prisms of nonproliferation, terrorism, sort of the security of our allies, Iran, attacking Israel is one reason, one fear that we have, which is why we're concerned about what happens in Syria and the end game there. But I think we now have to add back in that prism of great power competition, while still not neglecting those other factors which really motivated us in the 90s and 2000s.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Well answered. Mara, your mention of the 6-month period of no U.S. aircraft carrier in the Gulf raises the question, to my mind, of U.S. staying power. Mike mentioned Trump wanted to pull back, yet the stated policy in Syria is that U.S. troops will remain in Syria as long as Iranian forces are stationed outside Iran's borders, which to me means forever we're going to be in Syria. But there are other indicators of the one you mentioned of the aircraft carriers that Secretary Mattis seems to want to reduce the American footprint. So can you talk a little bit about U.S. staying power in the Middle East?
Absolutely. It's unfortunate that when we think about U.S. staying power in the Middle East, we baseline over the last 2 decades. We do that, frankly, our regional partners do that as well. And that's not terribly fair, right? The last 2 decades, the U.S. is overwhelmingly focused on this region, particularly in a security sense. And so if you baseline at the top, you're only going to be disappointed. You're only going to ask questions about staying power. So if I had to guess where Secretary Mattis's head is, it is that while this region is still important, he has a whole lot of other balls to juggle and to worry about. Moreover, I suspect he is deeply cognizant that at the end of the day, especially when we look at the problems in the Middle East, the U.S. military has a role to play, but it is merely a piece of a much larger pie. It is a tool that, frankly, the U.S. has overwhelmingly relied on for a bunch of reasons, and that has some costs to it. And so looking around the region and looking at all of the places in which the U.S. doesn't have ambassadors, for example, right, where you see a diminished diplomatic presence or diminished assistance, that has real costs, no doubt. I remember being in Iraq last year, for example, and hearing from one of the interlocutors about the many ambassadors the U.S. has cycled through, and then that being compared to the Iranian ambassador, who all the Kurds knew well because the Iranian ambassador they had known for decades and decades since he had helped fight their war against Saddam next to them. Right, so it's a different approach. There's a temporal dynamic here. There's a capabilities dynamic here. So kind of in government speak, you would want to use all the tools in the toolbox. We've kind of overwhelmingly focused on one of those tools. Now, to wrap up, you mentioned this issue of the U.S. military presence in Syria, which is a pretty thorny one. There's 2,200 U.S. military personnel in Syria. I think over the last year or so, we have heard all sorts of different answers about what they're doing there. Of course, according to the authorization of the use of military force that Congress has gifted to them, they're supposed to be focused on fighting all sorts of nefarious actors. That is clearly a piece of what they're doing, but as we've heard out of the Trump administration, over the last 10 months or so, they're also there to fight the Iranians, to serve as a presence, to help stabilize, you name it. I will tell you, this is an area of profound concern to me. I say this a day after the anniversary of the Marine barracks bombing. It's pretty clear in the Marine barracks bombing that there's some scary analogies to the U.S. presence in Syria. The 2,200 U.S. military troops in Syria are there as adversaries. We should not delude ourselves into thinking they are not, or kind of satiate ourselves with these ideas of being a presence or being a stabilizing force. This is very similar to what we saw with the Marine peacekeepers, if you will, in Beirut. Unsurprisingly, a whole bunch of actors saw them as having a nefarious purpose against their agenda.
Thanks, Mara. Mike, your vision of U.S. interests and policies in the Middle East is almost like a 40,000-foot approach, looking kind of broadly and long. It almost seems divorced from party politics, who's in the White House. But can we come down to the partisan politics here and think? I should have prepped you with this question ahead of time, so forgive me that.
I like surprises. It's okay.
Come next week, if one or two houses of the Congress change, would this have any impact on U.S. policy in the short term? And then, in a couple years after that, if the White House were to change again, do you think there would be again? Do you think there'd be a shift in U.S. interests? Maybe not interest, but policy.
So I think the answer is possibly yes. Let me preface my answer to this by saying I think that on Mara's last answer, I think I largely agree with her. But I see tremendous obstacles to the right kind of policy, right? So ideally in the Middle East, because we have these other challenges like Russia and China, and I agree with you about how Secretary Mattis and other defense leaders probably see the problem. Ideally, the United States would confine ourselves to providing capabilities that are unique to us when they're necessary, as well as then capabilities that involve training and so on and so forth. And we'd leave all the middle stuff out to our allies to do. This is sort of what Joe Votel talks about when he says by, with, and through, right? The problem is that it doesn't work quite as neatly as that, right? I mean, as we can see in Yemen. In Yemen, we're providing mid-air refueling because it is a capability that's not unique, but it's a capability where we're strong and we can sort of bring it to the fight. And our allies are actually contributing some sophisticated capabilities of their own that we've managed to build up over time. Strike aircraft, special forces, and things like that. The problem is that even with all that, even with those significant capabilities, they're causing a level of civilian casualties that is, I think, troublesome to us, especially given our modest involvement, which I think leads us to believe that we're culpable in some way. And they're not able to end the war. They're not able to bring the conflict to resolution. And so while that kind of strategy thus looks nice on paper, and it makes sense strategically as you kind of lay out our global priorities, in practice, oftentimes it's a lot messier. And it leads to some difficult decisions. Do you do more things yourselves? Do you simply have to sort of say certain things aren't going to be done at all? Or do you simply step back and say, if our allies want to do it, they're going to have to do it without our help? It's a very difficult decision and one that I think policymakers grapple with every day right now. The question about politics, I would just say, unfortunately, I think our policies in the Middle East for a long time, I think were ones that were matters of bipartisan consensus. Things like support for Israel, things like opposition to Iran, even support for the Saudi relationship was, even if it didn't always sit well with people, was largely not a partisan issue in Washington. I think foreign policy overall has become more partisan. And I think that as I see commentary these days, and frankly this was true during the Obama administration as well, about policy issues in the Middle East, I think it's through a lens of opposition to whoever's in the White House, opposition to whoever's in Congress, and so on and so forth. And so I do worry that, yes, if Congress changes hands, if the White House changes hands, you'll see this kind of pendulum swinging in American policy, not just in this region, but in other regions. And one American ally, official of an American ally, I should say, said to me the other day, with respect to one issue where they were getting some pretty sort of stark demands from American policymakers, they said, well, we got very different demands from President Obama, and we have no doubt that we'll get very different demands come 2 to 6 years from now. And so, why should we bother, essentially? And this is a big problem for us, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. It's time to go to the audience. I think you were provocative in using the by, with, and through phrase, because you know that Mara wrote something, an article about this. So he set you up. Okay, we'll take maybe 3 questions. Wait for the microphone to come in the back here in the white shirt, John, and then we'll, if you want to, write any of these down.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, very much. I'm John. I'm the Principal National Security Analyst for Jones Group International. I'm curious.
Is the microphone on?
Yeah, I think it is.
Good. Okay,
There we
good.
go. What are the implications on U.S. policy if the various different countries in the Middle East successfully transition to a non-hydrocarbon economy?
If the countries in the Middle East transition to a non-hydrocarbon,
Like Saudi Arabia, for example. Let's say that Jordan successfully transitions or gains an economic-based economy as opposed to what it is today.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Well, we could extend that. Go ahead. Thanks, John. We could extend that to if consumers around the world, did. I mean, that would be easier. Any other questions here to get started? I want to take a couple at once here. Let's go here to the 3rd row, and then we'll come up to the 2nd row here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Wallace Hayes. Thank you for your presentation. Michael, my question is primarily, the first part is primarily for you. I think my calculation is since 1980, we've bombed, invaded, or occupied 14, if you don't count Yemen, 14 Islamic countries, mostly in the Middle East. So when you say it's going to be, our policy is going to be more aggressive, are you talking about more aggressive than the previous administration, or are you talking about more aggressive than what we've done over the past 40 years?
Okay, thank you. And then up 2nd row here, Talal.
Talal Absi, Mr. Bahrain. I think the point about what Michael was talking about kind of the call for kind of, accusing, I don't want to use accusing, but I guess that's the word, of U.S. allies in the region being free riders, and then now you're talking about kind of overdoing it, really captures what's going on, kind of the trouble we go through as diplomats. But I would, the idea I want to kind of explore with you guys, given your background, is that when you look at 2003, the war in Iraq, right? All U.S. allies in the region were against it because it's would create a vacuum that Iran would have felt, which is more or less kind of what happened. And then you look with the JCPOA, there was the concern that signing the deal wouldn't address the other issues, and then it was supposed not to address the other issues, but it was kind of a policy of active disengagement in the region, which kind of a vacuum that other regional powers and international powers kind of filled in. So the question would be, I guess, kind of that comment is that shouldn't future U.S. policy be kind of more inclusive of U.S. allies in the region, and kind of figuring out how to deal with problems, and making sure that also obviously like U.S. leadership is important in the region, but also kind of the idea of taking ownership of challenges in the region. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Talal. Well, so 2 of the questions specifically sort of question things you said, Mike, or at least addressed to you, but I think it was unfair because, to me, Mara's point about U.S. partners in the region being flawed was much more provocative than what Michael said.
Or not. I think everyone just agrees with it.
So, Mike, why don't you go first and address at least those 2, and then the one about non-carbon future, if you want, and Mara, you can pick up.
Sure. So let me address the second question first, because unless I misspoke, I don't think I said that the U.S. was going to be more aggressive in the future, and I don't think that we are. I think that if you look at the 2000s and through the sort of first portion of President Obama's presidency, I don't anticipate that President Trump, or frankly the next American president, is going to want to take on anything like the level of commitment that their predecessors have done. So I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. But I think that we're going to be looking for a policy in the region which allows us to accomplish a lot without that kind of commitment, and that's going to be very challenging. This idea of sort of standing back and unconditionally embracing our allies, I think, is not playing out in the way we want it to. What I would argue is that we need a more intensive engagement with our allies, is what I think I said, in order to help produce the types of capabilities over time that we want. And that's going to be intensive and expensive, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's more aggressive. I'm going to leave the third question to Mara, to be fair, because she may sort of disagree with what I had to say about it in any event. On the hydrocarbons question, well, I guess what I would say is, look, number one, the two types of things that we're talking about, both the premise that you laid out as well as the premise that Mark laid out, are, I think, distant prospects. The idea of transitioning an economy of an oil exporter to primarily relying on non-oil income, non-oil government income, non-oil business activity is a tremendously daunting prospect. And I think we'd all be hard-pressed to identify virtually any country in the world that had succeeded in doing that. Maybe Norway is on that list, but I think they may be the first and last country on that list, and they're in a very different situation, a very much nicer region, in a sense, than any of these countries. So as you look, for example, at Saudi Arabia, putting aside all the everything that's happened in the last few weeks, just the notion of moving Saudi Arabia from an oil-led economy to a private sector-led economy is an enormous undertaking that I think has a low chance of success, even with the best mix of policies. And I think that's true across the region. For any countries which are oil consumers, that includes Jordan and the United States, I think we're a long way away from not being dependent on hydrocarbons. The United States has a great advantage in that suddenly we are relatively independent when it comes to the supply of hydrocarbons. But that doesn't make us independent of hydrocarbons, period. Still you have to worry about prices of hydrocarbons, which are generally determined globally. And of course, we worry about our allies who are themselves quite dependent on oil imports, as we were saying. Countries like Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, India, go down the list, are dependent on oil imports and will be, I think, for the foreseeable future. What is happening is, as a result of the shale revolution and everything else going on here, as well as a different trajectory of consumption, both here and in China, going in different directions, is that suddenly China is going to be the significant consumer and importer of oil in the world, and the United States is not any longer. In fact, that's already really the case. And that is bound to have a very significant impact on this sort of pattern of relationships in the Middle East. Because there's no doubt that the fact that we have long been an oil consumer, we've needed it for both strategic and economic reasons, and the Middle Eastern states like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so forth have been the providers of that oil, has been a foundation of the relationship. And it'll be a foundation for another kind of relationship between China and the region. What that ultimately looks like, I can't tell you, but I have a prediction, which is that China's economic interest in the region, like just about every other rising power in history, lead inexorably to more diplomats and more soldiers arriving in the region. And that'll be a concern for the United States.
Thanks, Mike. Mara, you get the disengagement question, and anything else you want to pick up on?
Sure. So a bunch of thoughts. First, on this idea of working by, with, and through, it's important to note that this is a term that has gotten really hot in Washington over the last few years. And yet we should note, when you look at U.S. policy post-World War II, our policy is littered with attempts at by, with, and through. So it's a nice phrase. Turns out we've done it a whole lot. I wrote a book on this in case you suffer from insomnia. And the real bottom line on this is, turns out it's also really hard, right? You have different priorities than your partner. It takes a really long time to change what your partner is doing. It is not a panacea that, frankly, many of us understandably want us to be. So let's be cognizant of that. So then we get to this idea of disengagement. And I might open up by first cautioning you against blaming all of the region's ills on the Iraq War. I think that is lazy and has gotten much too popular in Washington and also in the region. It's a complicated region, right? We are about to see the 100th year anniversary of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And if you've been watching the region over this last decade, you can't help but say, look, that has had an effect, right? That's why we've seen uprisings, etc. I don't want to diminish the impact the Iraq War had on the region, but it is one of all sorts of variables that played a role in what is a thorny and complicated region with profound institutional challenges. So what does this inclusivity look like? To be frank, the U.S. has no treaty allies in the Middle East, so we should be cautious of throwing around the term ally when we look at the region. You do have major non-NATO allies. If you've read about MNNA, it's not worth a whole lot, as you probably know. So there are not treaty allies. Let's remember these are partners. That said, I think inclusivity is a great thing. There are a number of people in this room, both up here and also in this audience, who spent lots of time and energy trying to get the region to work together. The Gulf Security Dialogue that the Bush administration tried to do is a perfect example. You saw the Obama administration also try to do it. You've seen now the Trump administration through retired General Zinni also try to do it. What a wonderful notion. Get a whole bunch of Gulf countries to collaborate, particularly on security, against a threat that they all seem to agree is a problem, Iran. And yet, when we look at the progress that has come from this policy, over 3 administrations now, it's rather unsatisfying at best. So I support the idea of inclusivity. We should find ways to make it happen. I'm terribly curious to know what those would be like, because we have seen time and time again attempts to bring those to fruition, and frankly, all sorts of partners across the region pushing back at those.
Great answer, Mara. Thanks. Okay, we'll get another round here. This gentleman in the third row, first of all, and then across the aisle, then up here.
Alan Kieswetter of the Middle East Institute. This is my third think tank event today, and it's
the best, right?
Yes, and the first 2 had topics not related to the Khashoggi affair, but they dominated the conversation. So my question to you is this an important inflection point in U.S. policy?
Okay, thanks. Right across the aisle here.
Hi, Dylan Rittman. I'm wondering what you guys think future U.S. policy in Afghanistan should be in light of kind of your overall view on the region, as well as in terms of resource and monetary allocation that we put towards that specific arena. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And then up here in the front, thanks.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Scott Cooper with Human Rights First. I'd like to ping on your question about Beirut. It was 35 years ago yesterday that 241 Marines and sailors were killed. That was kind of a seminal event. It led to the Weinberger Doctrine, the Powell Doctrine. We were very reluctant to be involved. And what we have now is a situation where we lost 4,500 in Iraq. We lost 1,200 odd in Afghanistan and counting, but we're not as reluctant to engage. What are the implications of that, or are there implications of the fact that we consider our presence there, our continued treasure and blood to be shed without much of a cost, or it's not a cost?
Mara, I'm going to ask you to go first, since you had one question directed to you, and then we'll go to Mike.
These are some terrific questions. So to run through them briefly, on the horrific and mind-boggling Khashoggi affair, which calls to mind anyone who watches The Americans, apparently it wasn't just on TV. Here's the thing. There are a bunch of events that have happened over the last year that I would suspect have disturbed a lot of folks, right? Prime Minister Hariri's kidnapping, that sort of odd situation there. MBS putting his mom under house arrest, the Ritz-Carlton fiasco. Those are some domestic examples of foreign policy in there. Yemen, obviously, being another. So there's a whole bunch of moments that I would suspect many people in this room kind of winced rather discomfitingly. So the interesting question is, well, why does this one matter so much? Does this one matter just because a whole lot of Washington and European elites happen to know this individual and to meet with him? I would say that is definitely part of the answer, but I do think there's something a little more interesting there that at least has nagged at me a little bit. It's the idea of going after someone like Khashoggi. Right? This is not someone who is loudly screaming, MBS is terrible, let's get rid of him. Right? This is someone who is generally politely trying to say, hey, I'm worried these reforms aren't quite going the way they are. Right? Someone who's pushing an envelope a little bit, but I think you'd be really hard-pressed to point at him 6 months ago and say, this is an enemy of the state who you must get rid of. So it's kind of extra worrisome along those lines. I don't envy the folks in the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department right now that are trying to balance how to think about U.S. national security interests and the relationship with Saudi Arabia with all sorts of ugly things, this being just the most recent one. On Afghanistan, it's now 17 years and counting. I personally think we need to be cognizant that having the presence we have today, while many will say it is not terribly robust, it's still about, what, 12, 13 or so thousand. Remember, there's a rotational element in there, so it's not like you can just say there's 12,000 people in the U.S. military focused on it. You have the folks who are getting ready to go in, the folks who've just been there. And what worries me is there is an opportunity cost to that. In particular, look at the sort of war that they're fighting and that they're focused on. You could argue that is a very different type of war than the ones they need to prepare for in the future. So my personal view is that the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan should probably be de minimis, and yet some sort of level of involvement is important. The final piece, Scott's asking a really important and disturbing question. I mean, I'll be frank, Scott, I suspect you're one of the only people in this room that can throw those numbers out about the U.S. casualties taken in the last 17 years. And I'm confident that if we go to Wisconsin, for example, you'll be really hard-pressed to find any. And that's so interesting, right? You have 241 U.S. military personnel killed in Beirut, and there's this massive uproar. 17 years, you have thousands and thousands of Americans killed, and there's not even a whimper by the American people. And I think that's really, really a question worth asking about. Frankly, I think as long as the numbers stay that low and it's a steady stream, we will continue to see U.S. public disinterest, and the forever wars can continue.
Indeed.
So I'll be extremely quick because I know there's more questions, and I largely agree with everything that Mara said. I think that the Khashoggi affair it's horrific. It's a tragedy, both for those who knew him and for those who have a lot invested in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. It is the worst crisis since 9/11 in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and it's not just because of this one thing. It's obviously there's been a buildup of problems and sort of difficulties in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And in past cases, 9/11, the oil boycott in the 1970s, the U.S.-Saudi relationship has actually emerged stronger. And circumstances today are different. Now you have, in addition to this crisis, Saudi Arabia going through generational succession. And a lot of us who watched this relationship for years or decades worried that generational succession would prompt real instability in the kingdom, in the region, and in the relationship. And I worry that is what we're seeing. Now we're seeing that exact scenario play out. It's important that the U.S.-Saudi relationship remains strong, but it's going to take a level of, I could go back to my term, intensive engagement, a level of engagement and a level of sort of wisdom from the administration that's going to be tough. It's going to require a lot of deftness from this administration to steer through this particular crisis. Afghanistan, I don't disagree at all with what Mara said, although I'd just add in one element to it, which is we said at the outset, American grand strategy has changed a lot since 2001. And the reason we went into Afghanistan is sort of strategically we've come a long way from there now. Now we're talking about great power competition. And it's important that we not just look at Afghanistan in its own right, for its own sake, but we think about where it fits into this grand strategy that we're following now of great power competition. And I'm not going to offer an answer to this because I'm neither a China nor a Afghanistan expert, but I think we'd have to ask the question of what we're doing in Afghanistan, how does it play into that? Are we sort of relieving the Chinese of a burden that they'd otherwise face on their western flank? Are we gaining a sort of important ally in that sort of competition or rivalry against China and Russia, which is off to the north? We do need to think about it through that prism rather than just kind of going on and doing what we're doing. And just on the last point, I think that the way I'd answer this question is I just think it's tremendously important that we have robust oversight of American policy in the region and beyond, especially when it comes to military commitments. And I think this is one product, in a way, of the partisanship over foreign policy, is that we don't get the level of oversight that I think we should be getting, because instead what you see is that sort of whatever party is the White House's party in Congress tends to form a team with the White House, and we don't get the level of checks and balances that we should have. I think that it's in all of our interests, regardless of what your party affiliation is, to go back to robust oversight by Congress and, via Congress, by public opinion, by the American people, of not just our operations here, but our military operations around the world, to ask, are they accomplishing what we want? Are the resources worth it? Are the lives lost, especially, worth it.
Thanks very much, Mike. Keep the microphone a minute. Let's go get another round here. The woman in the second row, then the woman in the third row, and who else? Hands up, and then the gentleman way in the back. Yeah, you're going to be second. Yeah. Okay, right here, right here. Right. Yep. Good.
Hi, Mary Beth Long. I think I've worked with both of you.
Thank you, woman in the second row.
Yes. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I know you.
That's okay. Last time I come here. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. We've been very strategic, very interesting. Let's get down to some brass tacks. I just came back from Lebanon and Jordan, and everybody wants to know what is the role of Syria in our Middle East policy. We talk about the Gulf a lot, but we're sort of whistling past the graveyard in their view of the role of the resolution or lack thereof of Syria for the future in the Middle East. What is the U.S. policy in Syria, and how does that fit into the U.S. policy in the Middle East? They were at some difficulty to articulate that. If you go to Lebanon, I think the consensus is it's all but a failing state. If you go to Jordan, there's a lot of worry about the future of the kingdom, and all of that tied to what happens in Syria, and then what happens with Iraq as a result of Syria. What's the solution, and what is the policy?
Thanks, Mary Beth. Back in, yes. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi. So both of you guys mentioned.
please.
Oh, sorry. My name's Nasib. I'm with World Affairs Council DC, and both of you guys mentioned Yemen briefly, and then you, Mr. Singh, you also mentioned U.S. allies in the Middle East, like Israel and Saudi Arabia. So I don't know if everyone knows this, but today is actually United Nations Day, where the United Nations was founded in 1945. And a month ago, United Nations said that one of the worst famines that's ever happened is happening right now in Yemen. So my question is, does the U.S. policy just seem to just ignore what's happening in the Middle East when our allies are involved? And earlier this year, the United Nations also condemned Israel and the United States for recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, moving the embassy there. So it kind of seems like U.S. policy seems to ignore what a lot of the rest of the world is saying when our allies are involved in the Middle East, and seem to ignore other things that happen that are really horrendous when our allies are pretty much involved. So just what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, thanks very much. And then the last question, gentleman far in the back.
Charles Perkins, AIPAC. This is mostly for Mara, but really for both of you. I hope I'm not misinterpreting what you're saying about the great power rivalry and near-peer competitors versus the Middle East as a sort of a zero-sum game, because I think that we'll see what happens with Russia and China going into the Middle East over time. But how would you see, again, if we're shifting towards more of a focus on Russia and China, do we ultimately end up, because we're not willing to, we'll see even with the INF going away, we're not willing to fight directly, just as with the first Cold War being fought in Nicaragua and the Golan Heights and Vietnam and so on, Angola, do we see a situation where the gradual, the Belt Road Initiative with the Chinese and now the de facto permanent presence of the Russians, will there be enough of a Chinese and a Russian insertion into the Middle East overlaid over the regional actors, perhaps combined with a gradual U.S. stepping back, that suddenly we'll wake up and we realize, uh-oh, these are the two countries we worry about. We better get back into there in the Middle East, and somehow it becomes a battleground of the great powers, so to speak.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Good questions, specific questions to end on here. So you got the microphone, Mike, so why don't you try to do justice to these?
Okay. So let me answer the last question first. So I tend to agree that great power relations we certainly should not see as a zero-sum game. I hope that our competitors around the world agree with that. I'm not sure they always do, frankly. And I tend to agree that if you look at, for example, the U.S.-China relationship, and I've written this many times, because one of the things I write about is Chinese policy in the Middle East, that we know we're going to have a lot of competition with China in Asia. It's going on today. I think that we could look at the Middle East as a place where we could potentially preserve some cooperation in the relationship, because we do have overlapping interests. neither one of us, I think, have a particular desire to be solely responsible for what happens in the region in any sense. And I don't think our partners in the region want to see their region become sort of a battleground between these two great powers. A lot of our allies have good relationships with both ourselves and Beijing, Israel, Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth. The P5+1 nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, was negotiated with U.S.-Chinese cooperation. I was a critic of that deal, so I'm not sure where that comment leads you, but I think that there's a good point to be made there. The same could be true, frankly, of Russia, and obviously the Trump administration has held out hope for U.S.-Russia cooperation in Syria. But I think that the Russians do tend to see, for example, that as a zero-sum game, because I think that one of their objectives is to take the United States down a peg and thwart what we're trying to accomplish, which sort of takes us to Mary Beth's question about what role does Syria play for the United States. Now, I have dispatched Jim Jeffrey from our think tank to go and solve this problem, so you can't accuse me of doing nothing. But it's a good question. I think that the way we originally thought of Syria, we can't think of Syria that way anymore. I mean, when the war broke out in Syria in 2011, I think that plenty of analysts of all stripes worried that this war would have reverberations for the region and for the world. And as we have seen, it really has. I think you could draw a direct line, for example, from the Syrian civil war to the rise of far-right populist politics in Europe. And so it's an example, to me, of how inaction can really have negative consequences for us sometimes. Now, I think that folks on the other side of that argument might say, well, it's sort of a non-falsifiable proposition. Maybe we could have done more and we still would have had the disaster that we have today. I think, though, as we look now at Syria, we need to sort of put the past behind us and look, okay, going forward, what's a threat to our interests and how do we address it? And as you look at that, we worry about things like the return of ISIS. I mean, that's the simplest kind of answer to the question in a sense, but in many ways one of the most complicated and important, right? ISIS is, as you know very well, Mary Beth, the second iteration, or maybe the third, I've lost track, of this particular problem for us. And we don't want to see a third or a fourth iteration of this. And that's, I think, why one of the main reasons why it's important to keep some American presence there in eastern Syria and to have strong partners in eastern Syria. But I think that's not the only concern. Another concern, I think, is, again, this proximity now that exists between Iran and Israel and the prospect that creates for a wider regional conflagration. We're not going to get every single Iranian proxy or troop out of Syria, but can we sort of create space between Iran and Israel? Can we stop the Iranians from putting certain capabilities into Syria in conjunction with the Israelis? I think there are red lines we can set. Red lines are kind of a sort of dirty word now when it comes to the U.S. policy in Syria. But there are red lines we can set and enforce without contemplating, say, a full-scale invasion of Syria. There's also obviously still a humanitarian angle to this. I mean, you have millions of Syrian refugees around the world, internally displaced people within Syria. You have people who are basically hostages, prisoners in a sense, in the Idlib area. And there's no real solution in sight to that. And as much as we worry about Yemen, we should also worry about this problem, right? I mean, this is a humanitarian problem still. It's not as though we can say, well, that's water under the bridge. It's not. There's still plenty more suffering to come in Syria if nothing is done. So I think, to me, we have interests at stake in Syria. We need to be realistic. We're not going to solve Syria in any kind of grand way. It's probably going to be piece by piece that we're able to address this problem. And our leverage is limited, but it's real. So our troops are leverage. Our willingness to use military force there is leverage. Our allies around the world are leverage because, frankly, Iran and Russia are isolated on this question, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it. It seems like they're in the driver's seat. And frankly, then our willingness to contribute things like economic reconstruction funding is leverage as well. So the trick that Jim will have to address is how do we use that leverage to address these problems I was talking about. And right before he went in, Jim helped co-author a Washington Institute product which addressed this very question, which I'd refer people to.
Okay, thanks. Mara, you get the last word, and I hope you'll touch on the Yemen question as well.
Indeed. All right. I actually largely agree with a lot of what Mike said. Mary Beth, you asked a really difficult and important question. You know, I think for all of us, Syria over the last few years is a reminder of the Vegas rules idea. You know, turns out what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay there as much as you might want that to be the case. And so what do you do? How do you make this to be a least bad option? You try to help the Jordanians as much as possible. And the U.S. has tried to do that, particularly trying to get Gulf partners to help the Jordanians, because Jordan, having the king and his leadership stay in power is really, really important. So we want Jordan, despite the massive refugee inflows, to be as stable as possible. Ideally, you want to do the same with the Lebanese, who are a little bit dicier in all sorts of ways, as you know. What's particularly disheartening on the Syria piece is, as you recall, there were so many times over the last decade and a half that we worried about the Iranians kind of establishing an arc across the Middle East. Well, we don't have to worry anymore. It's happened, right? I mean, and they've done it pretty magnificently. There's a terrific report that Brian Katz just published out of CSIS that talks a lot about this idea. And so it's a little bit of a different ballgame, I think, than when it was a decade and a half ago when you're trying to stop the Iranians. They're now in all sorts of places. We used to just get to worry about Hezbollah. Well, now you've had this magnificent train the trainer program where Hezbollah has been able to set up all these sort of pseudo proxies also around the region. So I think Mike's prescriptions are spot on, but they're going to be really, really difficult for Jim Jeffrey to try to implement. If anyone can, it's probably him. But when you think about kind of things that matter most in the region, I put Syria top of that list, absolutely, and worrying about the Iranians. On this Yemen piece, it's a horrific situation, as you no doubt know. Unfortunately, it is not a top national security interest of the United States, and Yemen hasn't been. At the end of the day, when we look at this, and this is a story of multiple administrations, the concerns from Washington about Yemen have largely focused on containing all sorts of nefarious actors, and they haven't gone beyond that. I'm hard-pressed to imagine beyond perhaps superficial humanitarian aid that really changing in any sort of way. What I was hearing from you in your question, though, is, well, why does Washington treat kind of some parties in one way and other parties in another way? It comes down to relationships and what the U.S. is willing to do and to rock the boat. And at the end of the day, Washington has this special relationship with Israel, and one would expect that that's probably going to continue at least for a bit. So Charlie asks this final question about China, Russia in the region. What does that look like? So to be clear, I'm not seeing it as zero sum. I would say globally, it's also not zero sum, right? China is a serious power. It's a serious military power, economic power, political power, right? So the U.S. needs to find a way to cooperate with it in certain categories. To the extent one cares about climate change still, that might be one case study. But in my mind, it comes down to an issue of bias. So there's cooperation, there's competition, and I think increasingly you see the need for competition and preparing for conflict vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, which is a weaker power, but I think still a kind of thorn in the side. Mike put it magnificently. The Russians do really want to take the U.S. down a notch in the Middle East. You see them almost reveling that, and I do think that's different than we see with China. So as you think about this, it's not zero sum. It's a matter of bias and figuring out how, where, and in what ways can we cooperate, but recognize that, at least as it relates to the Russians, you have to watch your wallet in the Middle East.
Okay, there we go. Good. This was a great panel, I think. I hope you agree with me. If the Manama Dialogue coming up on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is anywhere half as insightful, energetic, and informative as this panel, I think it'll be a great Manama Dialogue. Please join me in thanking the speakers, Mark Karlin and Michael Singh.